Good afternoon, and welcome to Track 1 once again. We have a panel discussion, minus one moderator, so we'll kind of make this up as we go. And this session is called Our Renewable Future: Wind, Solar, Community Solar, Jobs, Efficacy, Challenges, and Opportunities. I'd like to introduce the two panelists we have at the moment. Sylvia Hayes, who's the CEO of 3E Strategies with a strong background in environmental studies. And also, I'd like to welcome Jeff Bissonette, MBA, Executive Director of Oregon Solar Industries Industrial Association. Hope I got that right.
Sort of.
Good afternoon. Oh, come on, we're trying to save the world here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I know it's tough after lunch, and it's a tough speaking spot, but I'm sure that this conversation will be invigorating enough that we'll get woken out of our lunchtime, post-lunchtime stupor, and this hour is going to fly by. I am Jeff Bissonette. I'm not Sylvia Hayes. And I do work for the Oregon Solar Energy Industries Association. We are the solar trade group for the state of Oregon. And a couple of key businesses and key members here that we proudly claim: E2 Solar, which is a sponsor of this conference, Sunlight Solar, and also Eclipse Engineering are all members of OSEA, and we try and work on kind of a policy that creates kind of a stable business environment and a favorable business opportunity for solar in the state. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things very quickly, and then turn it over to Sylvia, who's going to talk. So I'm going to talk kind of about renewable energy specifically. She'll talk about climate more in general. Hopefully by the time we've vamped long enough, Jeff Beaman will come, who works for the Central Electric Co-op, that's been doing a lot of cool and creative things here locally to put some local context to it, and then have kind of a general discussion. And if Jeff doesn't show up, we may get to the general discussion sooner rather than later. For renewable energy and utilities, I like to say that for most of the 100 years that utilities have been in operation, they have been seen as kind of the safe and staid industry. It was kind of the old joke is a widow that had her investments always had everything based or invested in utilities because there was a steady return. But the utility industry is changing. We still want utilities to be safe. We still want them to be prudent. We still want them to make sure that the lights come on every time the switch is flipped. But the 100 years model that utilities have been operating on is changing, I think. And I think a lot of that is being driven by climate change. And some of those changes really do impact and favor renewable industries like solar. Oregon has had a very proud history in terms of clean energy, very strong dedication to investment in energy efficiency, the cheapest clean energy, because the kilowatt hour you don't have to produce in the first place is indeed the cleanest one. And also has been a very good market for renewable energy. First wind, which has really established itself about a decade ago, and now solar is kind of taking its place in the resource mix. And that's a good thing because as climate becomes more of an issue and as people realize the impact that our energy mix has on the climate and on our broader environment, there's an ever-increasing need to do more and do more quickly, but do more cost-effectively and efficiently as well. About 8, 9 years ago, 2007, Oregon adopted its renewable energy standard, requiring that the state and its, particularly its larger utilities, meet a threshold of 25% of renewable energy generation meeting load by 2025. And there's a lot of people involved in that effort. It was kind of a culmination for the time of energy policy that, again, had been very focused on energy efficiency and some renewables. But this is really where the state said, this is how we're going to meet our load going forward. And that was really the driving force behind the first renewable portfolio standard, which what I call RPS 1.0, because earlier this year we had RPS 2.0. And what that was a requirement for the state's two largest utilities, Portland General Electric and Pacific Power, that serves some area around here, to deal with coal. And so RPS 2.0, whereas RPS 1.0 is really about how the state overall is going to meet load going forward. RPS 2.0 is really directed at two utilities that are focused and have a good deal of coal, particularly Pacific Power, have a great deal of coal in their mix. And what the state of Oregon was setting the policy to do is we're going to take that coal out of the mix by 2030. And the question then is, how do we replace it? Because left to their own devices, utilities might just say, well, it's cheapest and easiest just to build gas. And so we just take out coal and replace it with gas. And that's not a great long-term bet either. Again, still a fossil fuel, still emissions, and still a risk to make that long-term investment in a fossil fuel resource. And so what RPS 2.0 did, that the legislature passed in February of 2016 with Senate Bill 1547, for those of you legislative wonks out there, said we're going to end coal use by 2030, and we are going to require that these two utilities meet a 50% RPS by 2040, really setting a direction for how that coal is going to be replaced, and replace the energy that's produced from the coal. In addition to that, and that was kind of the landmark headline piece of Senate Bill 1547 that was passed in February. In addition, another big piece that was passed that has a lot of interest is a policy framework for community solar. And obviously that interested the solar industry a lot, because there are a lot of people that want solar, but for one reason or another can't have it on their roof. Either, and I know this is hard to believe in Bend, but some roofs are shaded. Some people are renters and can't put solar on the roofs. There could be any number of reasons. In fact, nationally, the National Solar Energy Industries Association calculates that there's about 50% of roof space out there that is not that's not appropriate for solar on the rooftop. And so the question is, what do people do? And you don't want to say to folks, well, you're just plain out of luck, because they want to be part of kind of that solar movement, and it makes sense for them. It makes sense to offer them a place to participate in that, and that's really where community solar comes in. Community solar, as opposed to, say, a voluntary option, and if those of you who are a Pacific Power customer know that you can participate for $8, $10 a month and get and participate in the voluntary renewable energy options that Pacific Core offers. And that's terrific. You're supporting clean and renewable energy, you're supporting projects, and you're cleaning up kind of your share of the power pool, but you're not really seeing a direct benefit like you would if you had solar on your roof and you made that investment. And so what community solar is really trying to do is equate that investment in that you make on solar on your roof and say, I'm not making that investment on my roof, I'm making it on a project that's either in my community or at least somewhere in Oregon. And I'm getting credit for the energy that is coming out of that project. And you're actually seeing that on your bill the way you would if the panels were on your roof. Now that's pretty easy to understand and a good goal, but where we are now is to kind of figure out the rules of how exactly that operates. And so there's a ton of questions, and you may have them, like, well, how much would that cost? How would it show up on my bill? What's the relationship between the power that's produced and the power that shows up on my bill? The answer is right now, I don't know. And so to find out though, between now and July 1st, there's a process that's being run by the Oregon Public Utility Commission to establish the rules for community solar. And so, again, for those of you regulatory wonks out there, the procedure is AR 603. That's a rulemaking process, AR 603. And it is through that process that we will kind of figure out and answer all the questions that everybody has about community solar. The one thing that I will note that as a part of that community solar framework, there's a requirement that 10% of the program capacity be dedicated to low-income customers. And that was a very important and key part of the conversation, but a recognition that low-income customers should have a way to benefit from this as well. And what does that mean, and how is that going to be implemented? Again, I don't know. We're going to have to figure that out. And so I hope that I have an opportunity to come back and address a group like this in about 6 months, and I can give you a lot more answers. But if you want to track what's happening, we did set up a community solar subcommittee, and that is on our website, and folks can kind of follow along with it there. I think there will be a couple of key touch points here in the local community. I was talking with folks from the Environmental Center earlier, and I think they're going to be participating one way or another in the statewide discussion, and that will be a valuable piece of kind of local information distribution. A quick touch on 2017 and the legislative session that's coming up. We are still in the kind of final stages of at least identifying the key issues that are going to be on our agenda. There's going to be two main must-do pieces of business. One is the residential energy tax credit is sunsetting at the end of 2017, and that's a pretty key piece of selling solar systems to residential customers in the state, and is worth about $20 million to the solar industry. And it's important for, and right now the industry can't operate without that incentive, and so we'd like to see it extended sort of in line with the extension that Congress gave the federal tax credit incentive at the end of last year. And if we could align those, that would be very helpful. In addition, there is a property tax exemption that if you put solar on-site to offset on-site energy usage, it does not impact property taxes, and that's been in place for a while. Also sunsets at the end of this year, or sorry, at the end of next year, and we are going to have to try and extend that as well. So, a lot more to discuss, but I just wanted to give some of the quick highlights of the issues that we are working with to put it in a broader context. And we turn it over to Sylvia, and then we'll have a larger conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. He and I have been on this trail a long time together, but rarely here in Bend. So it's nice to have you here. And I really do want to give a shout out to Diane Hodiak and the others who organized this. This is amazing. This is a good turnout. It's the first such event we've had in Central Oregon. So I'm really happy to be part of it, and I'm really thankful for you all for coming out here. I'm going to go kind of big on the topic. Just today, actually, as I was getting ready to come up here, I get the daily emails from Grist magazine, and there was one in there today, an article saying how, similar to what we heard the gentleman from Portland, how most Americans care about climate change, but they never talk about it. And the reason they don't talk about it is because they never hear their friends and peers talking about it. So I just want to give us a shout out today for coming together as a community to talk about it. It's really important. I'm going to go pretty broad, and then I promise I'll come back a little more local. So although a lot of us have been working on the climate issue for a long time, and there is an increased sense of urgency, which is great. We need to deploy renewables. We need to have businesses moving toward emissions reductions. But I actually think climate is a symptom of a bigger problem. And that problem is the economic model itself. And I know it's very hard to talk about the economy and be sexy or interesting, but stay with me and then I'll bring it back home. One of the things that I've worked on a lot related to an alternative, evolved economic system is addressing the fact that we're living in a system that says we have to have continuous escalation in the growth of the economy and in growth of natural resources on a planet of finite natural resources. And we judge the performance of our economy based on gross domestic product, GDP. If GDP is going up, we're said to be healthy. If it's going down, not so much. The problem with that is GDP simply measures the amount of money flowing through the system and not what that money actually produces. So under GDP, the money spent to keep a kid in juvenile jail counts as exactly as positive as the same amount of money spent to give that kid an education. I've done some work in the Gulf Coast after the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and it wasn't too long after that unbelievable calamity that reports started coming out that all the money being spent to try to deal with it actually boosted GDP. So in that metric, that event made the economy look stronger. And I like to point out that even the guy who created the GDP, Simon Kuznets, he warned not to use it to assess the progress of a nation. He said that, quote, goals for growth have to ask growth of what and for what. And I think that that's critically important. I've also heard it said, if you ask the wrong questions, the answers don't matter. And think about where we are, in this presidential election. Once again, the questions are, how do we grow the economy? How do we make it bigger? How do we grow more jobs? And those questions, I think, are not only ineffective, they're actually dangerous because they keep us trapped in this metric of, or this system of limitless growth. And unlike the really great presentation that we heard from Michelle Krim with City of Portland, they're not asking what kind of jobs do we want to create. And I'm going to come back around to that in just a second. So I think it's going to be hard to really effectively address the climate issue if we don't start asking better questions about the economic system itself. What's the economy for anyway? That's a great book, by the way, by a friend and colleague of mine. I'll come back around to that. It's super important. And what I am, wait, did you switch slides? Okay, stay here for a second. And I have to apologize. I haven't used slides in the longest time, and I know that these are super ugly, but I just didn't have time. I think there will be useful info, however. So I have been a member or a part of, I guess, what we call a burgeoning now new economy movement for a long time, and I know that many of you in this room are, even if you don't know it yet. And I just want to highlight some of these for you to go back and check if you're interested. The New Economy Coalition, it now has dozens and dozens of member organizations and is really ramping up. Again, What's the Economy For Anyway? Great book by the author who wrote Affluenza, by the way. He's a really super good writer. We have a lot going on with new metrics. There's a genuine progress indicator. I've worked a lot on that. There's a whole international team now that's working to take the GPI metrics to the whole next level. It's been run, the GPI has been run for many, many countries and a number of states, and what it does is it gives you an alternative. It gives you a way of saying, okay, here's the GDP, but what does that mean for our environmental capital and our human capital? What's the GDP growth actually delivering for us? Green for All, really, really good organization. The Next System project is very interesting. It's newer, and it's really beginning to ask the question of, as we move post-fossil fuel, as we move to a low-carbon system, what does that look like, and what are some of the things we're going to have to do regarding that? And this last one, I've done some consulting work with them recently, and Economy for the Common Good was a book that was written in German. It was published in about 8 languages, I think, before just last year being published in English. And it's a pretty interesting work. The founder is a guy named Christian Felber, and I think we've heard a lot of talk today about the triple bottom line. What I love about Economy for the Common Good and some of this emerging part of our movement is I think they're asking an even different question, and we're beginning to talk about it as a quadruple bottom line. A lot of triple bottom line companies, they're asking the important question of how do I minimize the environmental or social damage caused by my product or my manufacturing processes. Quadruple bottom line companies say, how can I start or work with a company a for-profit company that purposefully exists to serve the common good? And I'll give you just one great example of this. Through doing this work, and I've been doing some work with Oxfam International as well, I learned of this company called Premium Cola. They're based out of Germany. They're such an interesting model. They've been around for 15 years and are very successful, and I'll have more write-up of this coming pretty soon. But they're really, I first heard it and it's like, how can a cola company be all that green, you know, be all that sustainable? But their whole model is fascinating. They're on a limited growth model because they don't want to pressure the employees to have to expand too quickly. They're super profitable. They're also on limited growth model because they don't want to be owned in any way by the banks. They have employee ownership, and here's what's most amazing. They don't want to serve any plastic, so everything is delivered in glass. They run all the environmental footprint metrics to see what their distribution scale can be away from the bottling plant to keep them, I guess, a net positive overall. And if anyone outside that area wants their product, they freely work with them to establish their own business with it, and they give the recipe away. And their thinking is that they're going to benefit more by having a collaborative business model versus a competitive business model. They're super, super interesting. So let's flip to the next one. So I'm going to bring it back now because I was asked to talk a little bit more locally about green jobs. And this is just some work that I did long ago. For the state of Oregon, this is how Oregon now officially defines a green job. And numbers are tricky with this because in this day and age, you can certainly argue that the people with the electric bikes outside are a green job, or the folks like E2 are putting solar panels on our rooftops. But you could also argue that the logger who's out there doing selective thinning and forest restoration is a green job also. So, or even potentially the mechanic who's working on clean diesel. So it's really hard to drill down on it, but I wanted to put it up there as a starting point. And based on this, or based on the conversation so far, how many people in the room would consider yourself in green jobs? Quite a few. So if you can flip, and I'll come back around to this a little bit. I have done a lot of different jobs in my life, in the course of my life. Everything from horse trainer to heavy equipment operator to fryer chicken catcher. And that's probably the thing that moved me toward vegetarianism and also made me decide to become a first-generation college graduate, because I didn't want to stay there very long. I think for many of us, having to work a job that we don't have passion about or we don't feel like is contributing to the greater good is soul-killing. And the fact that so many people in this economy are stuck in jobs like that out of sheer survival, to me, is just another indicator of how this system really is not what we want. And I think that one of the critical components in making the transition to a healthier post-fossil fuel economy is creating better opportunities for people to make their living doing what's good for us, good for the earth. And I'll give you a great example. I was working on the poverty issue quite a bit when I was in the First Lady role, and I had this conversation with this young man, early 20s, up in the Portland area. And his family had been at or below the poverty line for generations. And he was very frustrated. He was having a hard time finding a job. And talk about asking a powerful question. He was so frustrated, and he looked around and he said, how can there be unemployment when there is so much work that needs to be done? And I think that's a critical part as we're thinking about how we, in our own little niches, begin to create a lower carbon post-fossil fuel system. How do we actually figure out how to monetize ability for people to make their livings, for instance, sequestering carbon or taking care of the most vulnerable members of our civilization? Just to give you, again, these numbers are tricky, but Oregon has been top 5 in green jobs, going back to that other definition, for years. I think we fell a few points this year. I think this is really important. Green jobs, even through the recession, green jobs were growing significantly faster than conventional economic sectors and tended to pay a little higher. And another really super important point that I don't want to get into it too much, but the amount of money being invested in especially solar and wind, but in all areas of clean tech, has just skyrocketed over what it was. It skyrockets each year over the previous year. So flip one more for me. This is terribly busy. I'll be happy to send anyone a slide. These are just some of the better links I have found. These are actual online green job links for people who are interested in it. I could tell you a little bit about each one. I have to call out the Enviro Center, Mike Rayleigh, right here. They've got one. There's not a whole lot on it for jobs right now, but there are a couple. And the Conservation Jobs Board at the bottom, that's a really interesting one. I only found that doing some research for this, but it's all over the world, and they've really just, like, they've got they're advertising for a director of sloths in Costa Rica right now. I wish I could just take off a year and go direct with sloths. So one more flip. I also have to say, one of the things that I have realized recently is how unbelievably destructive our current media model is. And I know there are many people in this room who are really frustrated that these issues get so little coverage, but I think there's an even more insidious aspect of it. I think the fact that we are now on the 24/7 clickbait-driven media model means that most of the coverage that mainstream media does give to these issues are about the catastrophes, the crises, the floods, what have you. We get very little coverage of the really good stuff that's happening and the alternatives that are taking place and the eco-entrepreneurs who are putting pieces of this new model in place. And I think the fact that we don't see that very often even disempowers those of us in this movement, because it keeps us feeling like the system is too big to shift. So I personally have completely changed how and where I get my news, given what I've gone through the last couple of years. These are just some of the outlets that I recommend, and I was remiss in not putting Grist on here. Grist does a pretty darn good job of going deep into the problems, but also sharing examples of these solutions. So if you can flip one more, I'm about to wrap up. And I always like to leave with this because there's been a lot of polling and a lot of messaging work that looks at how we talk about our economy and how our culture tends to think of it. And it tends to go in the areas of it's a huge, ginormous machine that's out of our control, or it's a force of nature that's out of our control. And I really like to point out the economy is not an act of God or a force of nature. It's a system of human-made constructs. We invented it, we have reinvented it over and over and over. There's a great little book, and it is a little book out of an organization up in Seattle called Gardens of Democracy. And they do a really beautiful job pointing out that the economy really is less like a machine and more like a garden. We're pruning it and shaping it all the time. And that's really, I believe right now, the greatest challenge and opportunity before our generation. So thanks, I look forward to discussion. Sure. Do you want to just sit up there? Or up here? It doesn't matter.
We are well ahead of schedule, and so there'll be time for many questions. I'm sure you have questions. Those are great discussions, by the way. I appreciate those.
Yeah, I like this casual lean on the table style too. Perfect.
I'm Julie.
Your second.
Okay, sorry.
Just a quick question. Sylvia, what does GPI stand for? What is that acronym?
It's the genuine progress indicator. So, and the reason that of all the alternative metrics that are being worked with, the reason I like GPI the best is it's the only one that can be straight across compared to GDP. It's the only, the GPI quantifies your fiscal capital, which is basically what GDP is, but it also quantifies human capital and environmental capital, or natural capital. So every place that it's been calculated and compared to GDP, even as GDP has grown, GPI has decreased pretty steadily. And basically it shows, to put it in finance terms, we are overdrawing our natural capital in order to prop up the kind of fiscal growth we've had. And the GPI is the only one that, again, that can be straight up compared to GDP.
Are they always inverse?
No, you.
Me.
Just say,
It's okay.
You and then-
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
okay, go ahead.
Are they always inverse?
The GDP and GPI?
Uh-huh.
Pretty much. Pretty much every place that they've been calculated to a greater or lesser degree, the GPI, there's a widening gap between GDP and GPI.
It's kind of anticlimactic. I had the great opportunity to attend the Verge conference recently, which is the convergence of technology and sustainability. And the hot topic of the day was the concept of a circular economy.
Yeah.
And what was interesting, I got to participate in this group, a workshop on it, was talking about we really need to change the model of considering us consumers. That's probably one of the biggest fatal flaws in our economic model we have right now. We're counted it based on the number of times we consume.
Yeah.
And then the piece I wanted to ask you about, and just a concept that had arisen out of this, was that in order for that any economy, you really accelerate with entrepreneurism and people seizing opportunities to see the linkages. And in this case, it's the link between, instead of take, make, waste economy, it's a closed loop economy where you're actually using waste products to generate a new product. And what was interesting to me about that is one of the flaws everybody saw in that was this need for competition. And you mentioned this idea of moving from a competitive model to a collaborative business model.
Yes.
So what does that take?
Oh, boy. If I really had the answer to that, I'm sure I wouldn't be right here right now. It's huge, though, and we didn't have time, nor was it the topic, but I speak about this kind of stuff a lot, and I think the economy of the future will be more collaborative. It will be more symbiotic for all kinds of reasons. I think we in the burgeoning green economy or clean economy have huge opportunity to lead that. So for instance, I'll go back to the premium cola example. They are a specialty niche, really high quality, high caliber soda pop, I guess. They've been, they've had big companies try to purchase them and they wouldn't do that. So they were a little tiny fish in this huge pond. But now because they've worked with like 9 other companies to get them started, and there's not a franchise or anything else, they get them started. They don't even charge for their recipe. They've now got their own little block within that huge beverage industry. They have more power that way. So I think I don't know what it takes to get there, but I think I really do think a whole lot of it's about our own consciousness. And at the end of the day, I have always said, this is spiritual work for me. I mean, I don't think humanity is going to come into balance with the rest of nature if we don't have a shift in consciousness. And part of that comes down to what kind of, I don't want to sound too woo-woo up here, but what kind of energy do you want to be dealing with in your business practices? This same cola company, they've never had a contract. They've never signed a contract with a vendor or anyone else because they want it to be a handshake and they've never been sued. And they've been profitable for 15 years. So they're super proud of that piece, by the way. Their founder is really an interesting guy. But I know that was vague and nebulous, but I think that I'm super excited about the circular economy component to this. I think it's a really important new emergence in the field of sustainable business. I've had amazing conversations like with Eileen Fisher, huge fashion company, who's really into sustainability, really committed to it. And we've had a great conversation about how do you balance that with being a company that is constantly trying to grow sales of its product. And they actually chose this year to stop growing. They were opening approximately 3 new stores a year. They decided to curtail that, and instead they invested in a better recycling program, which they'd already been doing, and a better kind of repurposing and recycling facility, and they grew several jobs through that instead. There are many more companies starting to look at this, but we've got to go past a limitless growth model. We've got to remember enough, and we've got to remember that we're the only species on the planet that creates poop that can't be processed by the rest of the planet. That's a circular economy. So it's exciting that you went to that.
And just a quick few words from kind of the solar industry's perspective is that's really kind of what's changing the discussion around energy and utilities, because up till now, for the last 100+ years, we've been in the position of, the utility produces electrons, we consume them, we get billed for them, that's it. But solar in particular allows customers to sort of be generators and generate and offset some of their usage, in addition to the efficiency that you should all be doing as well. But there's electrons that, when you don't need them, can be made available to other folks, and that is a huge industry shift, and that is not the way utilities operate. And so, we're talking about, way technical stuff like the resource value of solar and how, what the value of that resource is to the utility system, aside from the jobs created and public health benefits and all that sort of thing. And so, I think just looking at that as a microcosm is how we, have to sort of rethink a lot of different parts of our economy, but, energy is a pretty key one. Also note, and do a quick commercial for Solar World, which is a pretty large producer of solar modules, solar panels, located in Hillsboro, Oregon. But they've started to figure out how do we make sure that our solar panels are captured and we have a zero waste solar panel, and that's something that they're looking for as well. So it's really, these discussions are permeating all throughout the economy, even in industries that, you know, we like to think by their very nature are green. We can always be greener. And way in the back.
So following up on that solar production, Central Electric Co-op, unfortunately Jeff's not here, but you know, they have already what they call their community solar, and I'm wondering if it's something different than what you're talking about, the regulations coming forth. And but if I can ask the sort of the follow-up on that is, at the same time, they've initiated a process to reevaluate their base charge because they're concerned about, you know, the solar thing that's happening in Arizona where the power companies there don't want to take power back from the grid and they want to charge the people with panels on the rooftops. And so they're actually delving into that because they're afraid that's going to happen in Central Oregon. And Jeff's not here to answer the question on how that's going, but they're in that process right now. And I'm just curious how your association relates to that.
Yeah, so a couple things. I think there might be some differences with how Central Electric sort of frames their community solar. But you know, right now there's not enough of it to really argue about. So we're encouraging them to keep doing what they're doing. And as a matter of fact, we're working with them and others of their co-ops and public power confreres to figure out how to apply the residential energy tax credit, which I mentioned briefly in my remarks, to community solar. Because again, whether or not you can put solar on your roof, you pay taxes, you support that program, you shouldn't have the opportunity to get a little bit of benefit back from that. And they're hoping that if they can do that, it really makes some of the projects that they're hoping to do pencil even more than they think they do now. In terms of the charge structure and the rate design and all that sort of thing, that is a very active ongoing conversation nationally. And being led by particularly sunny areas of the state, Arizona, Nevada, California, and not very well, frankly, because, and again, part of that is being driven by, well, you know, if somebody has solar on the roof, then they're not buying enough of the system that was developed to serve them, and so there's subsidies being happening somewhere. And and so I've often said, look, I'm a solar customer, I'm a net metered customer. Use me as an example. Who subsidizes me? By how much? And oh, by the way, did that subsidy start when I put solar panels on my roof 6 years ago, or when I switched out my mediocre efficient electric water heater for a high efficiency gas water heater, and 2 years later? And because you're not asking to charge me for that or for any of the efficiency I did, lowered my usage, but somehow when I put solar panels on and the effect of that, it looks the same as conservation to the utilities. Why is that all of a sudden a need to kind of redesign the whole rate design and to assume massive cross subsidies? And so that's another part of a discussion that we're having at the PUC, in particular at local consumer-owned utilities. It's up to their boards to have this discussion, but at the PUC we're having what's called a resource value of solar to determine in a methodology to say how much value the solar actually does deliver to the system, and if it's at or above the retail level, then that argument goes away. If it's much below that, then you still have to deal with that argument. But we think that the resource value of solar is going to be pretty close to or a little bit above retail value.
Sylvia brought up the question of how do you define green jobs, and I want to bring up an example and then ask you a question about that. The state of Oregon and other federal agencies are making a huge investment right now because of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And that's going to rural communities for grassroots jobs for environmental restoration. My hunch is that the level of environmental restoration may be the largest in our state's history, except possibly for the Great Depression. So how do we bring that to a better level of accounting so people really understand, rural, particularly urbanites, understand that this investment is being made and use, and what the benefits are environmentally and economically and socially?
Well, I think firstly, it's going to be doing as much as we can to tell that story, again, to get that story out there. But there's a lot to what you're saying, because in addition to classifying it a green job and being able to say, here's another segment, the ecosystem service value of some of what you're talking about, that'll be a really important part of this. So that's a shift, again, one of the shifts beyond GDP is also getting to where we're quantifying the economic value of what systems deliver. And I wrestle with that because I think ecosystems they have value in their own right, but we live in this world that everything, we want to be able to quantify it. So when you look at, for instance, the watershed improvement that might keep a municipality from having to add on to or expand, or pipe their water in from someplace else. Those kinds of things are not only, you can quantify them right now. There's an organization, I think they're based in Seattle. It's an organization, but it's actually a consulting firm called Earth Economics. And they do a lot of this kind of work, including with governments. Is this Jeff?
I am Jeff.
Yay, come on up. So I think you're really onto something. I'd be happy to talk with you more about that further, but I think really beginning to be able to better calculate the actually quadruple or even beyond that bottom line benefits to some of these kinds of jobs versus creating more jobs in factories building plastic stuff we don't need. I think it's a really powerful story. Are you ready?
I am ready. I deeply apologize. I was at a memorial service this morning that ran long, but I also ran up to Village at the 7th Mountain thinking that's where this meeting is. So I actually drove by here about 15, 20 minutes ago. I do have a presentation, but maybe we don't have time to get it complete.
We're down to the last 5 minutes.
Okay.
But there was a specific question for you, though.
Okay.
Well, actually, I would suggest dialogue between Mr. Bissonette and Mr. Beaman about what is community solar. I mean, I heard from Mr. Bissonette that regulations are just being promulgated for community solar, yet CEC has community solar, and whether those PUC regulations will come to shape Central Electric Co-op's community solar is two completely different.
Not two completely different things. There is no strict legal definition of community solar yet. And the loose definition is it's a centralized, larger project that participation on an individual basis is made available, whether you want to sell a panel or subscribe to a portion. And it's an option for people who would like to go solar but can't afford the price of a single system, the 10, 20, 30,000, whatever that might be. Their roof doesn't face the right way, they rent, they don't own, they have homeowner covenants, that type of thing. So that's kind of the loose definition of it. The way we do it, we have our project consists of 700 panels, and it has a generating capacity of 199,500 watts. And what we do is we sell subscriptions to quarter, half, or full panels, or more, if you'd like. And then we credit the owner of that subscription on their monthly bill for that proportion of the project's production that month. So in other words, we get a month's production, we divide it by 700, and then we allocate that to the account holder who holds that subscription. So as far as the PUC goes, as a rural electric cooperative, we are not governed by the PUC on matters outside of service territory disputes or safety issues. And so we have a member-elected board of directors that sets our policies, our practices, and our rates, etc. Does that answer your question?
That piece of it, but then again, maybe the conversation regarding the rate structure review that you're going through at CEC now, and how that will affect the benefit to members who choose to do solar on their rooftops instead. Because it seems like there's, I mean, well, maybe you could update us on what's going on with that process, because there's certainly concern that if it's going to make it unprofitable for people to put solar on their rooftops, if there's a new rate structure.
Right. So how many people in here are Central Electric Co-op members? Okay, so the reference to, at the risk of repeating something that's already been said, is rate decoupling, where you move to where you recover your fixed costs of labor, machinery, equipment, power poles, transformers, substations, etc. on a fixed cost charge. We call ours the facilities charge. That's stable and hold, and you pay it every month, regardless of how much you use, and then you have a separate component of your bill that is your kilowatt hour usage. So what we're going to be doing is introducing decoupled rates over it's actually 8 years, but 5 biennial changes. So our facilities charge right now is $12.77, and it's going to go up by about $2.50 in the first 2 years, and then our kilowatt hour charge will come down incrementally. So right now it's 7.9 cents. It's going to come down to something like 7.7. And so that is what will happen over the next 10 years. That energy rate will come down, that fixed cost rate will go up. What is unknown is exactly how much that energy charge will come down, because we pay Bonneville Power for our electricity, and they have rate increases projected for the future. And they always kind of overstate, and then what is actually implemented is a little lower. So it's hard for us to say exactly what that rate is going to be over that period. So for a self-owned system, it is definitely a bit of a disincentive from a energy cost recouping standpoint. From a community solar standpoint, we're still working through the analysis of this, but part of what we had projected in our project cost was lost revenues over the 20-year period. Well, now that is not as impactful as it was going to be, and the cost of a panel has come down quite a bit. So we're working up those numbers, working up the materials to educate and explain that to our members. So I think we're all familiar with the solar wars that have occurred in Nevada and Arizona and Hawaii. And essentially, that is a result of them not having done something like this and then getting hit really hard with the amount of solar growth. The amount of solar growth we're having is still relatively modest because our rates are much lower than Arizona, Nevada, or Hawaii. And distributed, individually owned generation is one of the elements that has motivated us to do this. There are other factors as well. Natural gas growth, there's a piece of legislation that's going to be introduced to incentivize natural gas expansion into areas that don't have it through general funding. It's just a proposal, but who knows how far it will get in the process. Energy efficiency continues to grow. So in other words, our motivation is because so much of our cost recovery is tied to the fluctuating use of electricity, we are starting to under-recover our fixed cost. And so the most balanced and most equitable way for us to do it is to get those fixed cost recovery mechanisms distinct from the energy cost recovery mechanisms. And we're phasing it in over 10 years, so it's not, doesn't create sticker shock, and gives people a chance to adapt to it. And we also can see how those energy cost changes will actually occur over that period of time. I guess that's it.
We have time for one more question. We'll get a late start break, but at least we'll have a break. And maybe Jeff can take more questions from you out in the hallway. We'll start up again at 2:15.
So one more question or not?
The $12.77 per customer that you charge is a facility charge. That's the same whether they're powering a mansion or a shack, right?
Correct, because
How do you justify that when one uses so much more than the other?
because anything that has to do with demand is already built into their rates outside of residential, and that's another issue that lies down the road is demand rates. But the volumetric component that's individual determined. How much energy do you use? Then that's what you will pay for, is the amount of energy you use.
That's precisely why I want solar on my roof, is so I don't have to pay what amounts to a demand charge that's the same whether I use a little or a lot.
Then your solution is to disconnect from us, because what you're getting is access to the systems and services that provide you backup power. And if
Yeah, but I don't require as much backup as my neighbor that uses twice as much per year. That's my point.
but the system has to be there.
The system has to be there, and a demand charge based on historic consumption is reasonable. A demand charge that's not based on your historic consumption is unreasonable.
There are lots of individual discussions on an individual customer basis that probably everybody's not as interested in. But the reality is, everybody has about 99.9% reliable power. And so everybody's paying for that 0.1%, well, 99.2 or whatever, that 1/10% that the system comes into play for reliability. So it's not really driven by volume basis. It's being on the system. It's a change, it's a big change. And there's reasons why we would do it versus an investor-owned utility. They don't have the same motivations.
Thanks once again.